everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I'm your host, Kerry Parker. Today we have episode 419 for March 10th, 2025. And yes, we have a news show for you today. Got a smattering of stories, a smorgasbord, a little bit of a mix of stories to cover for you today. Real quick, before we get into that, there were some important updates to Android, and we're actually have a couple stories about Android today. But if you've got an Android device, make sure you get that updated. Some of those bugs that were fixed were actually being exploited in the wild, so, may not be targeted against you, but you should still update those as soon as possible just to be safe. So in the news today, we're going to talk first a little bit of update about what's going on with the UK encryption story involving Apple. And then we've got another unfortunately related story about how Signal, the secure and private messenger that I recommend that everybody use because it's just dead simple and it works great, says they're pulling out of Sweden because Sweden wants them to add a backdoor and they are refusing, kind of like Apple was doing in the UK. We've got a story about the Medusa ransomware gang, which is demanding payment from a UK private health services provider. We've also got a story about some hackers who are publishing some very sensitive data from an Australian IVF provider. Brazil is now trying to do what the European Union has done with Apple and forcing them to allow basically side-loaded apps or alternative app stores. If you happen to own an Android TV, there is a massive, massive botnet, one of the biggest ever, of millions of these Android TV devices being hacked. And we'll talk a little bit about what botnets are and how that works. And then we do have some good news. Qualcomm and Google have decided to team up to offer 8 years of Android updates, which is fantastic. Google's also rolling out some additional AI scam detection for Android, which is interesting. On the flip side, Google is also finally rolling out its mandated support for what it calls Manifest v3, which sounds esoteric, but what it really means to you is that you can now no longer use really good ad blockers like uBlock Origin on the Chrome browser. So that will lead to my tip of the week. But also, I want to talk a little bit about some stories involving the Trump administration supposedly dialing back its cyber operations against Russia. It's not nearly as simple as it sounds, and the headlines got a lot of this wrong. So we do have a lot to talk about. Let's get right to it. All right, first up, let's catch up with what's going on in the UK with the Apple encryption stuff. Just to remind you, the UK had secretly told Apple that they had to provide a backdoor to their encrypted cloud backups for all users, not just in UK users or not just while they're in the UK, but everybody all over the planet. Somehow that leaked. Who knows how? Maybe somebody at Apple leaked it, or Apple quietly decided to slip this story to the Washington Post, but it got out, caused a big kerfuffle. Apple, because of the way the UK Snoopers Charter law is written, Apple wasn't even allowed to acknowledge that they were approached for this backdoor. And so Apple couldn't officially say that they did it, but instead of complying, what they did is they basically stopped offering one of their most important end-to-end encrypted backup services features for the users in the UK, which is their Apple Data Protection Program, which is fantastic. If you haven't turned it on, I highly suggest you do. So there's been kind of a weird update to this story, and this is from TechCrunch. Let me read this quickly. The UK government appears to have quietly scrubbed encryption advice from government web pages, just weeks after demanding backdoor access to encrypted data stored on Apple's cloud storage service, iCloud. The change was spotted by security expert Alec Muffet, who wrote in a blog post on Wednesday that the UK's National Cyber Security Centre, or NCSC, is no longer recommending that high-risk individuals use encryption to protect their sensitive information. The NCSC in October published a document titled Cybersecurity Tips for Barristers, Solicitors, and Legal Professionals that advised the use of encryption tools such as Apple's Advanced Data Protection, or ADP. ADP allows users to turn on end-to-end encryption for their iCloud backups, effectively making it impossible for anyone, including Apple and government authorities, to view data stored on iCloud. The URL hosting the NCSC document now redirects to a different page that makes no mention of encryption or ADP. Instead, it recommends that at-risk individuals use Apple's lockdown mode, which is a quote-unquote extreme security tool that restricts access to certain functions and features. By the way, it's really not that extreme. If you're ever in a situation where you're worried about your phone being compromised, like maybe you're traveling overseas or something, absolutely turn on lockdown mode. You could turn it off later. Anyway, Muffet reports that the original document, still accessible via the Wayback Machine, and by the way, that's a link in the article. If you want to see what it used to look like, you can read the article and click that link, has been wholesale deleted from the internet. TechCrunch wasn't able to find any encryption advice on the UK government's website. The UK Home Office and NCSE did not respond to TechCrunch's questions. The removal of the encryption advice comes weeks after the UK government secretly ordered Apple to build a backdoor that would give authorities access to users' encrypted iCloud data. Following the order, first reported by the Washington Post, Apple pulled its ADP feature in the UK and confirmed to TechCrunch that the feature will no longer be made available to new users in the UK, and its current users would eventually need to disable it. And we haven't figured out how that's going to work yet. I'll come back to that point in a second. Apple is challenging the UK's data access order in the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, IPT, the Financial Times reported this week. Okay, so I'm really glad that Apple is appealing it. They should. I'm not surprised that they are. The process allows for that. Unfortunately, what the process does not allow for is A, again, telling anybody that it's happening. So we're lucky that we know that it's happening at all. And B, you're not allowed to use the appeal to delay responding to the request. And instead, of course, Apple has just said, well, we're not going to have a feature that we say is end-to-end encrypted, but it's not. We're not going to lie to our customers. So we're just going to have to not allow people in the UK to have access to this wonderful security and privacy feature. And now they are appealing this ruling, which is great. I want to see this played out. I want to see this addressed and focus put on this in the UK. So we'll see how the appeal plays out. But also, I'm kind of thinking that what Apple is doing here is probably a pretty solid strategy. They didn't back their service, so that's good. So instead, what they did to comply is basically said, well, nobody in the UK can have end-to-end encryption, which sucks. They did it for new users first, meaning that anybody who had not yet turned it on now in the UK cannot turn it on, and they get a message saying they can't, not why, but saying just it's unavailable. But what they haven't done yet is they haven't, I guess, disabled it somehow for all the people in the UK who have already turned it on. And so I think maybe the game Apple is playing here is that they want to see how this appeal goes and see how it plays out in the court of public opinion now that it has leaked and gotten out. And I guess maybe they're hoping that there will be enough blowback that the UK government will change their mind and Apple won't have to go to the trouble of somehow dismantling ADP service or disabling ADP service for the people who have already turned it on in the UK. Now, sadly, this feature probably, honestly, hasn't been turned on by many people. I'm going to guess single-digit percentages and maybe even low single-digit percentages. I'd love to know the answer to that question. Apple probably won't say. But anyway, those people, you're still waiting for the shoe to drop on what's going to happen with their ADP service in the future. So we'll keep an eye on the story, and I will keep you posted as things develop. All right, next up, a very short article from the Sweden Herald about Signal saying that they're going to be pulling out of Sweden. And I'll just read this very quickly because it's very short. The government wants Signal and WhatsApp to be forced to store messages sent using the apps. And if that becomes a reality, we'll leave Sweden, says Signal's CEO Meredith Whittaker to SVT News. According to Whittaker, the bill requires the encrypted messaging app Signal to install so-called backdoors in the software. There's that word again. If you create a vulnerability based on Swedish wishes, it would create a way to undermine our entire network. Therefore, we would never introduce these backdoors, she said. The purpose of the bill, which may be passed next year, is for the police and security service to be able to request message history in retrospect for individuals suspected of crimes. The armed forces, on the other hand, are negative and write in a letter to the government that the proposal cannot be realized, quote, without introducing vulnerabilities and backdoors that could be exploited by third parties, unquote, reports SVT. So that's it. That's the whole story. And this story just keeps repeating, and it just keeps happening. This is all over the world in, what we would consider liberal democracies. that supposedly, have respect for people's privacy, but only to a point. And a lot of governments and law enforcement agencies, state level law enforcement in these countries are telling their governments, hey, we need to have access to this info. You can't let these people have private communications. And so they want privileged access. They want a backdoor. And again, that term is not really, it's not quite accurate the way it's used in a lot of cases, but it's the term we've come to use for these things. So it's kind of taken on a new meaning. But the idea is that the governments want some way for these companies to be able to hand over unencrypted data from all of their users. And these companies don't want to do that because it probably means that they're going to be lying to their customers about the quality of the privacy that they're given. And it's just a really, really slippery slope. So again, I'll keep you posted on these things, but it's happening all over the place, and it's really, really disheartening. All right, next up, this is from the Register, and it's about some Medusa ransomware hitting a UK private health services provider. HCRG Care Group, a private health and social services provider, has seemingly fallen victim to the Medusa ransomware gang, which is threatening to leak what's claimed to be stolen internal records unless a substantial ransom is paid. Previously known as Virgin Care and now owned by 2020 Capital, HCRG runs child and family health and social services across the UK for the NHS and local authorities, with the workforce said to number 5,000. Its annual turnover to March 2023 in its latest available figure was just shy of £250 million, or about $350 million. In an update on its dark website, the Medusa crew claimed it had stolen 2.275 terabytes of data from HCRG. That's a lot. And will either sell that information to a buyer for $2 million, or 1.6 million pounds, delete its copy of that info for the same amount, or leak it all online if no one pays up by February 27th. Now, obviously, this time has already passed, but in quick searching on the web, I didn't see any updates to the story, so I'm not sure if that has happened or not, so I apologize if I just missed it, but I haven't seen any update on that. So anyway, back to the article. Additionally, the gang claims it will delay the release for $10,000 or 8,000 pounds per day, presumably to keep negotiations open. It has already leaked samples totaling 35 pages of what's said to be pilfered information, including passport and driving license scans, staff rotas, which that might be an English term. I had to look it up. I'm not familiar with that term. So if you're not familiar, I guess it's also like a roster or a schedule for employees. It's not a term I had seen thrown around. Anyway, staff rotas, a birth certificate, and data from background checks. And this is a quote from an HCRG spokesperson. Quote, "We can confirm that we are currently investigating an IT security incident and have recently identified a post on the dark web by a group claiming responsibility. Our team has not observed any suspicious activity since the implementation of immediate containment measures, and we are working with external forensic specialists to investigate the incident. Our services are continuing to operate and safely see patients, and those with appointments or who need to access our services should continue to do so," unquote. For now, HCRG is still operational, a stark contrast to what happened in Texas last year when the University Medical Center in Lubbock was forced to severely limit operations and turn away ambulances following a ransomware attack. In HCRG's case, it appears Medusa has skipped over encryption, opting instead to steal data and hold it for ransom. So that's all I have to say about that. Again, I looked, I didn't see an update on this. Maybe they're still in negotiations for this data. But this is kind of where ransomware is today. It used to be, we've locked up all your data, and if you want to get back to normal operations, you'll need the key to unlock it. Therefore, pay us money and we'll give you that key. Somewhere along the line, they decided, you know what, as long as we're in there, why don't we exfiltrate all of that data and hold that data for hostage as well, threatening to release it, which gives them two pieces of leverage over the company that they've attacked. Not only are their operations down pending the decryption of the data on their systems, but they're also holding that data over their head, saying we're going to release this to the public or sell it to somebody else if you don't buy it from us first. Now, in this case, it looks like they're skipping the former and just going straight to the latter. So it seems like HCRG believes at least that they have fixed the problem and kicked them out of their system so that at least going forward, there's no more security vulnerabilities and patients and customers don't have to worry, but it remains to be seen whether that's true. Of course, if you need healthcare, you need healthcare. So you probably don't have much of a choice there. So the real threat seems to be that this information could be released if they don't come to some sort of an agreement on a payment. And again, you might be thinking, well, is there any honor among thieves? I mean, what's to prevent them from releasing it even after the payment? Well, the weird thing is most of these ransomware gangs have figured out that if they don't actually do what they say they're going to do, nobody in the future will ever pay. So generally speaking, most of them do what they say they're going to do after you pay the money. So it's kind of a weird twist there, but that does tend to be the way these things go. All right, next up, this is from TechCrunch. And it's about another hack of a healthcare provider, and this time it's in Australia. Hackers claim to have published a trove of sensitive data belonging to IVF, or in vitro fertilization, IVF patients after a cyber attack on Genea, one of Australia's largest fertility providers. Genea last week said it had experienced a cybersecurity incident that led to sensitive patient information potentially being compromised. In a statement given to TechCrunch on Wednesday, Genea CEO Tim Yeo said the company has since identified that, quote, data taken from our systems has been published externally, unquote. This statement came after the termite ransomware gang, which recently took credit for an attack on supply chain software giant Blue Yonder, listed Genea on its dark web leak site, where it claimed to have published sensitive patient data. Samples of the alleged stolen data seen by TechCrunch appear to show government-issued identification documents and sensitive medical records. In an updated statement, Genea said it was granted a court injunction on Wednesday to, quote, prevent any access, use, dissemination, or publication of the impacted data by the threat actor and or a third party who receives the stolen data set, unquote. Like that's going to matter. The whole point is this stuff has been stolen. Anyway, the court orders, as seen by TechCrunch, reveals that the hackers breached Genea's Citrix environment on January 31st before extracting approximately 940 gigabytes of data on February 14th. Genea said it currently does not know what data was accessed, and Yo told TechCrunch that the company is, quote, urgently investigating the nature and extent of the data that has been published, unquote. However, Genea did note that hackers had compromised its patient management system, which contains information such as patients' contact details, Medicare card numbers, health insurance details, medical histories, test results, and medications. Genea said that there was currently no evidence that patients' financial information, such as credit card details or bank account numbers, had been compromised. It's not known how many individuals may have been impacted by the breach, but Genea said it is communicating with both current and former patients. In its updated statement, Genea said it is working to securely restore its systems following the cyber attack, but it did not say whether the incident continues to disrupt patient services. ABC News was reported last week that the company's My Genea app, which enables patients to track their cycle and view fertility data, was taken offline as a result of the incident. So many of these articles about ransomware attacks, they make a point of saying no financial data was taken. And so that leads me to believe that the financial data was somehow, kept more secure and separate. If they've somehow taken extra measures to make sure that the financial data is secure, why not just make sure that everything is secure? I mean, it's probably two different systems, but nevertheless, it sounds like the financial stuff was secure and the patient data wasn't. I don't mean to laugh. This is obviously a horrible situation whenever these breaches occur. And this is, again, highly sensitive medical data. And when there are breaches like this, one of the things I'd like to say about the differences between security and privacy is when there are security failures, they can usually be fixed after the fact. You can get your money back, you can get your things back, etc. But privacy mistakes can't really be fixed. You can't erase people's memories. Once your private data is out there, it's out there. It's too late. You can't do anything about that. And yet we still can't somehow manage to keep our systems secure and our data private because it keeps getting stolen. Okay, next up, here's a short one from 9to5Mac, and it's about Brazil now kind of jumping on the EU's bandwagon to get Apple to open up their devices to applications outside of what's allowed on the Apple App Store. And this is very short. After the EU forced Apple to implement major changes to how iOS and the App Store work for European users, other countries have also conducted their own antitrust investigations against the company. Now the Brazilian court has ruled that Apple has 90 days to allow sideloading on iOS for iPhone users in Brazil. And basically, sideloading is a term used for like sidestepping or getting around the built-in official App Store. Android has allowed this for years, and Apple, most pointedly, has not until the EU forced them to do so. Back to the article. As reported by the Brazilian newspaper, and I hope I pronounce this right, Valor Econômico, a federal judge in Brazil ruled on Wednesday that Apple will have to open up the iOS ecosystem to third-party apps in Brazil, just like the company did in the EU. The judge considers that the limitations imposed by the company on developers could jeopardize the entry of new competitors in the segment. In November 2024, the Brazilian antitrust regulator CADE, ruled that Apple can no longer prevent developers from selling content and distributing apps outside the App Store in Brazil. The company would have 20 days to comply with Brazil's antitrust legislation, otherwise it would be fined more than $40,000 a day. Unsurprisingly, Apple appealed the decision, and the judge ruled that the injunction was unnecessary, giving the company more time to discuss the case. At the time, Apple said that the request to implement changes to the App Store wasn't urgent, and that it would also affect the company's business. Last month, Apple had to face a public hearing in Brazil concerning the case. But now, Judge Pablo Zuniga has ordered that Apple will have to implement the required changes in Brazil within the next 3 months. The judge states that, despite Apple's claims, the company, quote, has already complied with similar obligations in other countries without demonstrating a significant impact or irreparable damage to its business model, unquote. So I think this is a good thing. I still would highly recommend that anybody using an Apple iPhone only get apps from the official App Store, but they should absolutely have the right to go outside of that store if they wish and if they want to accept the consequences. And who knows? I mean, there should be the ability for somebody else to come up with an even better app store than Apple's app store. There should be competition. So I understand why Apple does this, and there are potential security benefits for Apple locking this down and being the only one allowed to have an app store, but I think we need to have the choice. We always should have a choice. So I look at this as a good thing. Even though I would not recommend anybody use anything necessarily outside of the Apple App Store, you should at least have the option to do so. So now I have to wonder how much longer it's going to be before other countries start making the same demands of Apple. And they have already implemented this. This is already a working thing. They took the engineering hit for this already, and it is now possible to do so. So I would not be surprised if other countries start, saying, hey, Apple, do that here too. Next up, this is from Tom's Guide, and it's about a new botnet, a massive botnet that is infecting Android TVs. And if you don't know what an Android TV is, it could be a lot of things. Basically, it's kind of like an Apple TV streaming device. It's an Apple-owned device that's running the Apple operating system, and then on that device, it has streaming apps usually, Netflix, HBO, Hulu, whatever. And other apps as well, not just streaming apps, but other apps that you might want to, games, for example, something you might want to show on your television. And in this case, the operating system is not the Apple TV OS, it's Android OS. And again, they come in many different shapes and sizes. One of the best ones was made by NVIDIA called NVIDIA Shield. That was really cool. I don't know if they even make those anymore. But there are several of them out there that are running Android. And anyway, let me just read this article. I just wanted to make sure you understood what we were talking about here. The Void malware botnet, that's Void spelled V-O-1-D, the number 1, found on 1.3 million devices back in September of 2024 has grown significantly. According to a report from XLab, a new variant has infected an additional 1.6 million Android TVs across 226 countries. That makes Void one of the largest botnets seen in recent years, surpassing both Big Pansy, which I'd never heard of, and even Mirai. Mirai was the big one. As of February 2025, the largest sections of infected devices were seen in Brazil at 25%, South Africa at 13.6%, Indonesia at 10.5%, Argentina at 5.3%, and Thailand at 3.4%. Not only is Void one of the largest botnets seen in recent years, far exceeding other sizable infections, but it also sees fluctuations and surges that suggest that operators may be renting the infected devices as proxy servers. That's one of the most interesting parts of this article. And one of the reasons I chose to read it. I'll come back to that in a minute. Notable surges, like the one which occurred in India that varied from 3,900 devices to 217,000 bots in a matter of days, indicate that the devices are likely being used in a kind of rental return cycle. According to XLab, in such a pattern, the bots are diverted from the main Void network to service a lessee's, that is somebody who has leased them, a lessee's directives, which would cause a sudden drop in the overall void infection count. Then, when the lease period ends and the bots return to the network, a spike is seen in the infection count as the bots again become active and under Void's control. A malware tool, the Void botnet, can compromise Android TV boxes as well as PCs and turn them into proxy servers so that they can help the hackers behind it facilitate malicious or illegal operations. The infected systems that become part of the botnet's network can relay traffic for the hackers, which shields their activity and is basically camouflaged from the other network traffic. This means the hackers controlling the bot network can bypass regional restrictions, security filters, or protections that have been hindering their fraudulent, malicious, or illegal activities. Void can also fake user interactions via plugins that automate ad interactions and simulate human-like browsing behavior to fake clicks on ads or views on video platforms to commit ad fraud and generate revenue for the fraudulent advertisers. Since the infection chain remains unknown, the recommendations are to follow a quote-unquote holistic approach, meaning to sidestep the threat at its source. This means you'll want to stick to buying streaming devices only from reputable vendors. Resellers and retailers who are trustworthy minimize their likelihood of a device arriving preloaded with malware. Additionally, users should also make sure to keep their firmware up to date and install the latest security patches as soon as they become available. Likewise, and get this, you want to avoid side-loading apps and stick to only using apps from the Google Play Store and other official app stores. Android TV devices can also have their remote access features disabled when not in use, which takes them offline. This can provide an extra layer of security to protect your devices and your data. Okay, lots of things I want to pick up on here. First of all, we haven't really talked about a botnet for a while, but a botnet is when the bad guys find usually weak, insecure IoT type devices on the broader internet, so they're reachable via the internet, exploit a bug in those devices to compromise their software. And the devices will keep doing what they're supposed to be doing. So the owner of those devices is often unaware, unless maybe they're really working slowly for some reason or kind of glitchy. But the idea is for the bad guys to control these devices without the users knowing that there's a problem. So while the device is doing its regular thing, maybe it's being a video doorbell, maybe it's being a security cam, maybe it's being a set-top box for which you play Netflix on. But behind the scenes, because these things are computers with operating systems, that means they could be doing other things as well. And so they've compromised these devices to run malware packages. And they get thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of these devices. And they're basically conscripted into this zombie army of IoT devices that will do the bidding of the command and control company or server. And often what they do is they use these devices as proxies to redirect traffic through them or to get these devices to do bad things on someone else's behalf to try to make it harder to figure out who is actually doing the attacking. Oftentimes, these botnets are used to try to bring down websites by flooding them with traffic. There are lots of uses for a botnet. So you can see that these are lucrative things to run as a service, which it sounds like Void is doing here. Like they've conscripted all these hundreds of thousands of devices, and then they're going out to other, malicious actors saying, hey, I've got this bot army that just ready to go. Basically, this mercenary army of IoT devices that have been conscripted without their owners even knowing it. And while these devices are sitting in someone else's home, you can pay me to have them do bad things for you. Along the way, what some of these things do just to make extra money is they commit ad fraud. And the way the ad fraud things work, if you post an ad, show that it gets enough clicks, well, someone is paying for each of those clicks because you got me a conversion. You showed an ad and somebody clicked on my ad. I want to pay you for that. Well, these guys are just willy-nilly clicking on ads to make money. They're not real humans. They go to great lengths to try to pretend to be human because some of these ads actually kind of have a built-in CAPTCHA thing or, is that really a human clicking on me kind of technology? So there's a cat and mouse game there. So while we've got these devices compromised, why don't we have them making money for us as well? And so they do ad fraud. So I'm kind of curious as to the locations of these devices. Android TVs are popular in the US, at least they have been. And yet all the compromised devices are outside the US. I'm wondering if there's maybe like a particular company selling these that, like this article says, that are coming preloaded with malware. Maybe there's some site selling dirt cheap Android TV boxes. And the reason they're so cheap is because these guys are making money elsewhere from this Void ransomware gang. So obviously, this article talks about keeping your firmware up to date, which is the software that runs on these appliance devices. Make sure you're updating your software. If there's a checkbox to make it automatically update, you should definitely do that. If your device is so old that it can't be updated, you probably should replace that device. And similarly, if you can't figure out how to update it, that's not good either. And maybe you should find a device that you can figure out how to keep updated. And finally, I thought it was funny, especially after reading that previous article. It talks about avoid sideloading apps. This is exactly what I was saying. You should absolutely have the right to do this. However, for security reasons, you probably shouldn't. And this is an example of perhaps where some of these devices were compromised by somebody who went around the Google Play Store, where the apps are at least somewhat vetted for security by Google. And because the Android ecosystem allows sideloading, you can go outside the Google Play Store and find an app somewhere else, anywhere else, and put it on your device. But sometimes those apps have security flaws or are just straight up malware. And then finally, it talks about disabling remote access features. I don't know why anybody would do this. There are devices that you can put on the internet that will make themselves configurable or accessible outside your home. That is just begging for trouble. So yes, I would certainly say that you should disable external access, though my guess is for an Android TV device, maybe what that means is while I'm traveling, I'm away from my home, I still want to be able to access the content on my Android TV, some TV show I recorded, for example. And so I want to be able to access from outside my house. Well, that means that anybody can access that device from outside your house. And if there's a security vulnerability on that device, it will be found and it will be exploited. There are automated tools that are doing this constantly, scanning the web for devices that are available on the internet. And if you make any of your IoT devices available to the external internet, in other words, outside your home, they'll be found by things like Shodan and other these automatic tools that scan the internet constantly looking for vulnerable devices. So yeah, generally speaking, that is a bad security practice. Okay, so we got a lot out of that one article. All right, here's an article from Ars Technica with some good news. Qualcomm and Google have joined forces to extend software updates on Android devices. With Google's assistance, the chipmaker has committed to providing extended vendor support to any OEM, or original equipment manufacturer, to any OEM building on its most powerful chips, pushing the theoretical lifespan of Android devices to 8 years. There are plenty of caveats, but this move could make your next phone more useful for longer. The extended support window only applies to Android devices with the latest Qualcomm chipsets. To start, the 8-year support timeline will be extended to devices running the new Snapdragon 8 Elite mobile platform, which has powered devices like the OnePlus 13 and the Galaxy S25. Later this year, the same policy will be applied to the company's new Snapdragon 8 and Snapdragon 7 series chips, and you can expect the same deal for at least the next 5 generations of Qualcomm silicon. Snapdragon 8 and 7 chips are used in flagship and almost flagship phones. Flagship in this case usually means expensive. So don't expect a new Qualcomm-based budget phone to get anywhere near the same update commitment. There's nothing stopping Qualcomm from offering the same deal with cheaper components, but people tend to expect phones that cost more to last longer. A cheap phone might not even make it 8 years before something breaks, or you get tired of how slow it is, and OEMs aren't incentivized to spend the money supporting cheap hardware. Currently, Samsung and Google lead the market with 7 years of guaranteed security patches and OS updates. With Qualcomm's help, other companies could reach similar heights. With Qualcomm support, OEMs will be able to provide 8 years of security patches, and there will also be at least 2 updates to the vendor's Android common kernel, that's like the most basic part of the Android operating system, during that time. This will make it easier for OEMs to release full Android OS updates even toward the end of the device's lifespan. This is just the latest attempt from Google and its partners to address Android's original sin. Google's open approach to Android roped in numerous OEMs to create and sell hardware, all of which were managing their update schemes individually and relying on hardware vendors to provide updated drivers and other components, which they usually didn't. As a result, even expensive flagship phones could quickly fall behind and miss out on features and security fixes. Google undertook successive projects over the last decade to improve Android software support. For example, Project Mainline in Android 10 introduced system-level modules that Google can update via Play services without a full OS update. This complemented Project Treble, which was originally released in Android 8 Oreo, back when Android used to have fun snack names. Treble separated the Android OS from the vendor implementation, giving OEMs the ability to update Android without changing the low-level code. The legacy of Treble is still improving outcomes too. Qualcomm cites Project Treble as a key piece of its update extending initiative. The combination of consistent vendor layer support and fresh kernels will, according to Qualcomm, make it faster and easier for OEMs to deploy updates. However, they don't have to. Update development is still the responsibility of device makers, with Google implementing only a loose framework of requirements. That means companies can build with Qualcomm's most powerful chips and say no thank you to the extended support window. OnePlus has refused to match Samsung and Google's current 7-year update guarantee, noting that pushing new versions of Android to older phones can cause performance and battery life issues, something we saw in action when Google Pixel 4a suffered a major battery life hit with the latest update. Samsung has long pushed the update envelope, and it has a tight relationship with Qualcomm to produce Galaxy-optimized versions of its processors. So it won't be surprising if Samsung tacks on another year to its update commitment in the next phone release. Google, too, emphasizes updates on its Pixel phones. Google doesn't use Qualcomm chips, but it will probably match any move Samsung makes. The rest of the industry is anyone's guess. 8 years of updates is a big commitment, even with Qualcomm's help. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in there, and I think it pretty much spoke for itself. But this was really one of the major issues that was called out in the security of Android versus iPhone for many, many years. And that was the Android ecosystem was so fractured, there were so many cooks in that kitchen, that getting security updates, important security updates, urgent security updates from Google, who makes the Android operating system, out to the phones that run the Android operating system could often take weeks or months or even never happen at all. Because there were gatekeepers along the way. Google would come up with a fix, this important fix, and say, okay, everybody who has an Android phone, everybody who makes an Android phone, quick, get this update into all your stuff. Well, Samsung and OnePlus and anybody else who makes an Android-based phone then had to go through their own vetting of that. They've tweaked the Android operating system for their custom device, and so they have to take those updates, incorporate them into their system, test all of the features of the phone to make sure nothing got broken, and maybe tweak things if they did, and then when they were ready, give that out to the people who bought their phones. And it's even worse than that, because a lot of times even the cell phone cellular providers for a long time, they also potentially have updates to, if nothing else, like let's say a Verizon app or some other Verizon level stuff, or AT&T, whoever your cell phone provider is. They often also on Android phones have control over some aspects of the Android operating system. So there were just all these different phases it had to go through. And so over the years, Google figured this out and has come up with some various mechanisms to work around this, which we talked about in this article, which is for the betterment of everybody who owns an Android phone. So that problem still exists today with Android versus iPhone. With iPhone, everything soup to nuts is owned by Apple. When Apple has a security update, everybody with an iPhone gets it right away. Because Apple didn't let anybody else, including, much to their chagrin, the cell phone providers that are using iPhones. That was something Steve Jobs really hit hard when the iPhone came out. And that generally means that the pipeline for security fixes on Apple is immediate and very, very short. And on Android, it could be very long and complicated, to the point where some Android fixes don't make it to the user till much, much later, meaning that their phones are potentially vulnerable all that time, or in some cases, not at all. But anyway, that's a lot of background. This story is good. This story is basically saying that Google has teamed up with Qualcomm to try to support their top model phones, the most expensive phones, for up to 8 years, which is really fantastic. All right, next up, another interesting Android development, and I'm a little less sure what I think about this one, partially because I'm not really an Android user. So some of these things have already been around, and I've not really had a chance to play with them personally. So anyway, let me read this article, and as usual, I will give you my take. This is from the Hacker News. Google has announced the rollout of artificial intelligence-powered scam detection features to secure Android device users and their personal information. And this is a quote from Google, quote, "These features typically target conversational scams, which can often appear initially harmless before evolving into harmful situations. And more phone calling scammers are using spoofing techniques to hide their real numbers and pretend to be trusted companies," unquote. The company said it has partnered with financial institutions to better understand the nature of scams customers are encountering, thereby allowing it to devise AI models that can flag suspicious patterns and deliver real-time warnings over the course of the conversation without sacrificing user privacy. These models run completely on-device, alerting users in the event of a likely scam. Users then have an option to either dismiss or report and block the sender. The setting is enabled by default and applies only to conversations with phone numbers that are not in the device's contact list. The tech giant also emphasized that users' conversations remain private, and if they choose to report a chat as spam, then the sender details and recent messages with that sender are shared with Google and carriers. The feature is launching in English first in the US, the UK, and Canada, with broader expansion planned for a later date. Furthermore, a similar scam detection for phone calls is being expanded to all English-speaking Pixel 9 Plus users in the US. The feature was first introduced in November of 2024. It's worth pointing out that while this feature is off by default to give users control, the call audio is processed ephemerally and is never used during phone calls with contacts. And one final quote from Google, quote, "If enabled, scam detection will beep at the start and during the call to notify participants the feature is on. You can turn off scam detection at any time during an individual call or for all future calls." All right, so real quick, that beep thing, by the way, is for, there are a lot of laws, at least in the United States, and it varies state by state, as to whether or not calls can be recorded without notifying the people involved that the call is being recorded. In some states, only one person on the call, one party, is required to consent for the entire call to be recorded, meaning potentially that the other person on the call, or maybe other persons on the call, were not even made aware that the call is being recorded, and legally they didn't need to be notified, and the call could still be legally recorded. Whereas in other states, and I forget which states these are, but in some states in the United States, it's two-party consent, where basically everybody on the call needs to consent. And so there will often be these indicators, this beep, that indicates that the call is being recorded so that, everyone is made aware. So in this case, the call I guess technically may not be recorded, it's being analyzed. Though I suppose if you report the call, maybe it is recorded so you could upload the call audio. But there's a couple key things about this that are good, if true. And that is, first of all the processing is done on device. And that's not true of a lot of AI features. A lot of AI features require cloud computing capability. So a lot of times that information, meaning potentially in this case, your personal information or the contents of your phone call, could be sent to a cloud for processing. In this case, Google is saying no. All the processing is done locally on the phone. Also, nothing is done. No automatic AI-based scanning of this call is happening if the person you're talking to is listed in your phone's contacts, which would be taken to mean that there's somebody you know. There's somebody you have a relationship with, somebody you ostensibly trust. So that also, I think, is a good default. And finally, it sounds like this feature is not available by default. You actually have to turn it on, which is also good. This should be opt-in. So it sounds to me, at least on paper from this article, that Google's doing all the right things here. And I think this is very interesting. This is basically like having a robot listening in on your calls for you with anybody that is not in your contact list, and pay attention to what's being said in case, things kind of go off the rails. Like, hey, wait a minute. This sounds like a scam that I've heard about from banks that goes along these lines. And this AI is listening to the conversation and saying, yeah, this sounds like a fraud, and then popping up a warning to you saying, hey, this sounds suspicious. I personally think that's kind of cool. Again, I'm an engineer, I'm a technologist, I love tech. But this is the kind of cool stuff that AI can be doing for us. It's already helping the bad guys. Why can't we use it for us as well? So anyway, assuming that, and this is a lot of assumptions, assuming all the things I said in this article about how they're doing this is correct, and everything's on device and it's keeping the privacy and blah, 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 I think this is a good thing. And I think we need more stuff like this, honestly. It's kind of nice that the potential marks can benefit from AI as well. Now, I will say just real quick that this whole thing about whether the caller is in the device's contact list. If I were a bad guy, one of the first things I would be doing right now is trying to find some automatic way or tricky way to get you to add me to your contact list. So fair warning, I think we're going to see some sort of scam, either social engineering or maybe through some weird Google API. I think we're going to find that the bad guys are going to try very hard to figure out how to get themselves in that contact list, because that would basically mean that would exempt them from this sort of AI scrutiny for scam calls. All right, so this next article is really long, and so I'm not going to read it all. I'm just going to kind of read the start of this one. It's had several updates because it's a very contentious story, but I really want to just kind of read the beginning of the story as a setup, and then I'll kind of just give you my summary of what's going on here and my take on all of this. Because this is really important, unfortunately, at least in the US right now. Because this new administration, again, not trying to be political, but I mean, the facts are that it's just chaotic. And I think that's actually kind of just part of the point. But without getting too much more into that, there's been a lot of confusion because things have been happening really quickly. And there's been some serious major policy shifts in this last month as this new administration has taken over in the U.S. Like them or not, there have been huge swings in how we operate. And it's causing a lot of confusion, and it's really kind of given us a hair trigger, and a lot of even old school news organizations have been falling victim to this, I think. So anyway, with that as a setup, let me read. This is actually a blog that somebody had forwarded to me. I'd never heard of it. It's called Zetter 0 Day. And actually, if this kind of a thing interests you, and I think it really honestly should interest all of us, at least here in the US, I encourage you to read this whole article and all of its updates, because I think it's a much needed, I don't know, I'm looking for a word, I'm not getting it, but like a check on our thinking right now. The real point of this whole story, and the reason I'm reading it, is that right now we need to be very careful about what we read, what we believe, without checking into it and doing some critical thinking, and myself included. I'm not saying I am perfect. So anyway, with all of that as preface, let me read the beginning of this very long blog article. Two blockbuster stories published on Friday that appear to confirm what many Americans suspected would occur under the Trump administration, that the new regime is going to be softer on Russia than previous administrations, particularly with regard to the threat that Russia poses in cyberspace. Since publication, however, one of these stories has been disputed, and the second story has raised more questions than it answered. Additionally, a third story has been published from the Washington Post, which offers new details. In the first story, The Guardian reported that the Trump administration had begun to retreat from the nation's long-standing position that Russia represents a severe cyber threat to the country. It has done this both in what the administration officials have said, or rather not said, about the Russian cyber threats, as well as through a recent memo at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, that reportedly redirected analysts away from tracking Russian cyber threats. The Guardian stated that CISA analysts who focus on Russian threats have been ordered, quote, to not follow or report, unquote, on these threats going forward. About 90 minutes after the Guardian story first published on Friday, The Record published a separate story revealing that U.S. Cyber Command, which is different, has been recently told to stand down on all planning against Russia, including offensive cyber actions against the country. Taken together, the two stories raised alarms that the policy changes would have a drastic impact on U.S. national security and make the country more vulnerable to cyber attacks from Vladimir Putin's hackers. The Record noted that the order to Cyber Command provided, quote, evidence of the White House's efforts to normalize ties with Moscow, unquote, and The Guardian quoted a source who said that the change at CISA represents a win for Russia. And the source told The Guardian, quote, Putin is on the inside now, unquote. Although a number of people on social media seem to believe the Record story corroborates the Guardian story, the two stories are reporting different things and are based on different sources. Cyber Command is a military unit under the Department of Defense and conducts both offensive and defensive cyber activity outside the U.S. This includes hunt-forward operations, assisting Ukraine and other nations in finding malicious activity on their networks, for example, conducting effects operations, cyber attacks that degrade, destroy, or disrupt an adversary's electronic systems, and taking down infrastructure used for malicious purposes against the U.S. or its partners. CISA, on the other hand, CISA, is entirely domestic and defensive in its mission. Its job is to help defend the federal government's civilian networks, and in parentheses, it makes the point that the NSA, or the National Security Agency, is the agency that helps defend military networks. And it helps the owners of critical infrastructure, most of which is privately owned in the U.S., defend these networks by conducting risk assessments, providing information about vulnerabilities, and patching guidance, and assistance with incident response after a breach when needed. Therefore, telling Cyber Command to stand down on Russia is very different from telling CISA to stand down, though the policy directives described in each story could potentially have similar effects in weakening U.S. security. Okay, so this goes on at length. That was maybe 20% of the story as I last checked it, because it kept adding updates. But it sets up this discussion. And what I want to say here is that, first of all, again, it's a very long story. It's very well worth reading. There's a link in the show notes. Check it out. Find some time to go through it if this kind of thing interests you at all. And honestly, I think it should interest all of us. But it's very easy today, with all the chaos going on and all the massive changes happening, some of which whiplashing back and forth from day to day, it's really easy to get caught up in this stuff and jump on headlines like this, especially if you didn't even read the articles. I mean, a lot of times we just see the headlines. And if the headline says, CISA was told to back off Russia, or Cyber Command was told to leave Russia alone or whatever, and that's all you read, that's going to kind of stick in your mind and you think, oh my, that's horrible. But I had at least two of my close contacts in the cybersecurity realm reach out to me and tell me that this was BS. When these things were first starting to hit the airwaves and everyone was freaking out, that there's like, no, read it carefully. Like, read the actual memo. Like, don't just go with what the article said. Look at the actual memo. And for example, some of these things were not that they were told to stand down. It's just that maybe some language was removed, but it's still part of their overall mission. So it's by default still something they do. It's just not something that they're explicitly told specifically to do. If you're a police officer and I don't put in your thing that I want you to protect Carrie Parker's house, that doesn't mean I'm telling you to not protect Carrie Parker's house. You're supposed to be protecting all the houses. And Carrie's house is one of those houses. And furthermore, another point that this article makes that we all need to keep in mind is these different agencies have different remits. They have different things that they're supposed to do. In fact, in a lot of cases, they have restrictions on the things that they are and are not allowed to do. They have different bailiwicks, different purviews, different remits, different missions, different capabilities, and different legal requirements and restrictions. So we can't just kind of lump them all together. So this is a cautionary tale. While this specific one is interesting, I'm also just generally saying we have to stop, we have to take a breath, we have to do our research and do our reading before we believe headlines in particular. Headlines are horrible because today the way it works in our clickbaity society is that, journalists, good journalists, write the articles, but they don't get to write the headline. Somebody in marketing or some editor somewhere gets to write the headline, and all they want to do with that headline is to get you to click on that link to read the article. So definitely do not be forming opinions based solely on headlines. Read the article. But in some cases, especially today when we're so trigger happy and so sensitive and so there's a lot of confirmation bias built into all of us, we have to be really careful when articles like this pop up to really think about them carefully, certainly before sending them on to others or ranting about them on social media. It's a tricky time to be alive. And so this is just me trying to put it out there that we need to be more careful and more circumspect. Now, I suppose I should say at this point that, again, this was kind of an example article. I'm actually commenting less about the contents of this article, though I think the way this person has written it up is still worth reading. I'm not saying either way whether or not there has been some clandestine orders given to some of our cybersecurity agencies to back off of Russia. If that is true in any way, shape, or form, that's bad. Russia is definitely the bad guy. Russia is doing a lot of bad things against us, and we should absolutely be protecting ourselves against them and keeping a very close eye on them. But I'm not really actually saying here whether or not I believe that is true, because it seems like it's a pretty muddy thing right now. What I am saying with this article as an example is we've just got to be careful when we see headlines like this, that we stop and think about it, certainly before spreading it, to think twice and dig a little deeper, because this stuff is super touchy right now and it's real easy to overreact. Okay, one more article, and I put this at the end because it's going to merge right in with my tip of the week. And I've got kind of a different tip of the week. We're trying something new this week. Okay. So this one's from the Register, and before I get into it, I can't remember how much this article explains it, but we're going to talk about this thing called Manifest v2 and Manifest v3. This is a framework, I guess, maybe, for the Google Chrome browser and all the browsers that are based on Google's Chromium engine, which, by the way, is like Edge, Opera, Brave. There's a lot of browsers that are under the covers, basically Google Chrome. And Google has been trying to figure out ways to track people and still, so they could have their advertising business and then somehow preserve privacy, because people are blocking ads and blocking third-party cookies and things like that. Anyway, this whole Manifest thing is, it's hard to describe in 25 words or less, but let's say it's a framework within the browser that any extensions or plugins or add-ons for that browser, and these little bits of extra software that you can install on your browser to give it extra functionality, have to comply with. And Google has threatened to roll out this new v3 and mandate that all extensions use it for some time now. I told you about this a while back, and it is now finally happening. And basically what it is doing is neutering ad blockers. So let me read this real quick. Google's purge of Manifest v2-based extensions from its Chrome browser is underway, as many users over the past few days may have noticed. Popular content blocking add-on uBlock Origin is now automatically disabled for many in the ubiquitous browser as it continues the v3 rollout. For context, Google has given users plenty of warning that the end is nigh. In June 2024, the Chrome Web Store began alerting users of uBlock Origin that support was on the way out. The extension depends on the Manifest v2 architecture to work, and Google has gradually phased out support in favor of Manifest v3, version 3. According to the company, Google's decision to shift to v3 is all in the name of improving its browser's security, privacy, and performance. However, the transition to the new specification also means that some extensions will struggle due to limitations in the new API, or the Application Programming Interface. In September 2022, the team behind uBlock Origin noted that one of the most significant changes was around the Web Request API used to intercept and modify network requests. Extensions such as uBlock Origin extensively use the API to block unwanted content before it loads. However, the new rules have made things trickier, and alternatives that are unlikely to have the same functionality are now required. In October 2024, Google began disabling installed extensions using Manifest v2 on the stable channel of Chrome. At the time, Google said, quote, "This change will be slowly rolled out over the following weeks," unquote. A few months later, and here we are watching Manifest v2 finally gasp its last. Ad blockers and privacy tools are the worst hit by the changes, and affected users, because let's face it, most Chrome users won't be using an ad blocker, can switch to an alternative browser for something like the original experience, or they can switch to a different extension, which is unlikely to have the same capabilities. In its post, uBlock recommends a move to Firefox and use of the extension uBlock Origin, a switch to a browser that will support Manifest v2, or downloading a different extension, uBlock Origin Lite, for example. The move has been a long while coming, but it might still come as a surprise, as it did even to this writer. Okay, so I've been talking about this for a long time because Google's been talking about this for a long time. I've kind of told you what I thought about it then. I'll just tell you again briefly now that this really, I can understand why Google is trying to couch this as a security thing, the same way Apple couches it as a security thing that it doesn't want to allow any other alternative app stores. But in the end, we should have that choice. And in this case, Google is removing that choice for you from anybody who uses the Chrome browser, and probably a lot of the Chrome, probably a lot of the browsers that are based on Chrome. Now, these other browsers could, like Edge and Opera and Brave, and I think I know Brave is definitely doing this. They could still maintain support for Manifest v2 as well as Manifest v3. And that is exactly what Firefox is doing, which is made by Mozilla, which is a completely different browser. The engine underneath the Firefox browser is not Chromium. Nevertheless, because we want a common ecosystem for supporting extensions, this whole Manifest thing that Google's come up with still is kind of the universal standard for making a browser extension. So by supporting this, when somebody makes an extension for Chrome, that should automatically or mostly work on Firefox as well, even though the underlying browser engine is totally different. But Crucially, Firefox, not being based on Chromium, but is using these manifest frameworks, is going to continue to support Manifest v2 so that people can continue to use great privacy-enhancing technologies like the uBlock Origin browser extension. So this leads right into my tip of the week. And I'm I'm doing a little something different. You may not notice it actually on the podcast, but for the blog that usually goes along with this, my blog and my newsletter usually correspond to the tip of the week in the podcast. And my blog articles, because I'm a verbose person, honestly, and because I like to be complete, I like to give as much information as possible. My blog entries have steadily gotten longer over the years. And that just means it takes a lot more time to write as well. And so I've kind of made the choice that I need to start doing shorter, more to the point and simpler and actionable tips of the week and articles for my blog. And so I kind of went roundabout with some brainstorming using ChatGPT and tried to come up with a cute name and a cute theme for some of these articles that will be very short and very to the point. They will have a kind of a standard format. They'll be kind of fun because it works with the dragon theme, and I'm calling them dragon hacks. Now, I really came close to calling them dragon snacks, kind of like Scooby snacks. I thought that would be really kind of funny and punny, but I went with dragon hacks instead, kind of like life hacks, but these are dragon hacks. And the theme of these is that there's an enemy, a dragon you want to slay. I'm going to give you a weapon with which to slay them, and then I will tell you how to bask in the glory of your victory. In other words, kind of prove to yourself that the things are better the way they are now. So with that in mind, the very first one in this new series is going to be slaying ads in your browser forever. In this case, your dragon enemy is Chrome, the browser. If you are still using the Chrome browser, or worse yet, if you're using Microsoft Edge, which is based on the Chromium engine, if you are still using one of those browsers, I'm begging you right now, just try this out. Just try Firefox. Firefox is not perfect. Firefox and Mozilla have problems, but from a privacy perspective, from a purely technical standpoint, it is so much better than Chrome. And now that Chrome is enforcing this new Manifest v3 thing, in particular, there's one extension that the top one that I recommend that everybody install, and that is uBlock Origin. If you have not experienced the web with uBlock Origin, you do not know what you are missing. But I want you to find out today. So if you go to my blog article, it's the top one at firewallsdon'tstopdragons.com. Of course, there's a link in the show notes. It will give you all the links and the steps you need to do this. All you really need to do is download Firefox and install it, run Firefox, and once you run Firefox, install this add-on, this extension called uBlock Origin, and there's a link in the article that'll take you right there. All you got to do is click that, and it'll have a button right there to say install. So when you're in Firefox, go install uBlock Origin, and that's it. Try it. Go side by side. Bring up Chrome and bring up Firefox with uBlock Origin installed with all the default settings, and I gave you like a half dozen websites to try. Some of the most notoriously bad websites for pop-ups and ads and crap, and just see the difference. See how much faster it loads in Firefox when it doesn't have to load all the crap. Look how much simpler the page looks without all these ridiculous ads all over the place. You just have to try it and experience it for yourself. When I see someone else browsing the web without a good ad blocker like uBlock Origin, I can't believe they can stand it. It's like, what is that? What are you doing? Because it's just so horrible today. So I'm telling you, just try it out. That is your quick dragon hack for the day. There's never been a better time to switch away from Chrome, and I would like you to personally try out Firefox with uBlock Origin. If that doesn't do it for you, you can try Brave browser as well. That's also pretty good. I'm not going to get into it all again here. I've got my reasons, but I personally currently, and this stuff does change over time, but my current vote is Firefox plus uBlock Origin. You will not regret it. So there you have it. There is your news and your tip of the week. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for this week. I hope you enjoyed your news and your tip of the week. I've got a great interview next week with Josh Summers. He's the guy who runs the wonderful website called All Things Secured. If you have not checked it out, you definitely should, especially if you're the kind of person who likes videos. Yeah, he's got a lot of great video content. And Josh is just a really nice guy. I'm glad to have finally gotten together and met him and done this interview. I've got a lot of other great interviews in the pipeline. Just yesterday, I recorded an interview with Zach Edwards, and we had a really interesting discussion about how real-time bidding works and how location tracking works and how horrible it's gotten in light of things like Gravy Analytics and some of these other data breaches for these data brokers who've been gathering all this information, and then we're shocked to find out that hackers want that information too and breach their data. Now, as you're probably aware, I have bonus content for my patrons. So people who go to patreon.com and sign up to become patrons get bonus content, bonus podcast content. On the weeks where I have interviews, that bonus content is extra Q&A with the interview guest. But what I started implementing a while back, and I think there's more than 70 episodes or something now, is something that I called Merlin's Musings. And this is for my top patrons, and this is what I fill in for the bonus podcast on the news show weeks. I don't cover more news stories. I just cover different topics. And the reason I called it Merlin's Musings was to kind of, first of all, Merlin, Dungeons and Dragons and all that kind of stuff, that theme. But also I wanted to kind of leave it open to just cover what I want to cover. And so sometimes they're technical topics. Sometimes they're a little behind the scenes stuff for the podcast and the blog and the book. Sometimes, honestly, they're just sort of interesting random topics. And so that's what my top tier patrons get on the Thursdays when I have news shows. And so that will be coming out this Thursday morning as usual. And just FYI, if you ever do become a patron, you immediately get access to all of this bonus podcast content. I'm probably overdue for a patron promotion, maybe a Dragon Challenge coin promotion, so I'll be thinking about that. But I have an ongoing thing. If you become a patron at a high enough level and you sign up for a full year all at once, you can actually get something I call a prize from the treasure chest, which in this case is like an annual coupon code for a very popular product like Proton or Malwarebytes or Savings Portmaster. And as I use up those, I'll probably try to get new ones, and I'm open to ideas for those as well. So anyway, if you sign up annually to become a patron, every year that you re-up, I will basically subsidize that if you do it at one of the higher levels by giving you one of these coupon codes, which are usually worth, $40, $50. So anyway, if you're interested in that, I don't talk about it that often, but if you're interested, go to fdsd.me/support, and one of the options there will be Patreon. If you want to wait around till I finally get around to doing another Dragon Challenge coin promotion, if you want to see what these really, really cool challenge coins look like, go to fdsd.me/coin2. That's the number 2. And you'll get a little glimpse of what these things look like. And I'm hoping to do another promotion for these sometime in the next few months. All right, that'll do it for this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next week, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.